for that. We always do, right? It's on the MeetUp. The link for the GitHub site's on the MeetUp, and the slides are on the GitHub side, and the lab pieces. We're not gonna do labs today. We'll probably just talk until we're kind of done today, because today is about an overview of SQL Server 22. The goals for the workshop, they're pretty clear, and you've seen these before. There'll be some repetition. There'll be a preview deck or a preview set of slides that we'll kind of throw up every meetup. So we want to have this be interactive, and we want you to maybe participate in the labs when we start to do the labs. Now, next month and May, especially, we're going to do connection to Azure with uh, Azure Managed Instance link. So SQL Server 22 connecting to Azure Managed Instance, and then SQL Server 22 connecting to an Azure Synapse SQL pool, and then we'll talk about um, Microsoft Purview and how you can have Purview policies that are incorporate or are kind of over the policies that stand over SQL Server 22 and effectors you can do in SQL Server 22 because of a policy that's in Purview. And we'll also talk about Azure Active Directory Authentication, SQL Server 22. So we'll talk about these specific features. We'll talk about why you might want to upgrade. The idea is that you get some hands-on experience. If you're spinning up a virtual machine in Azure, and I think I have a slide here later. If you're spinning up a virtual machine in Azure, or spinning up a virtual machine in GCP or AWS or in your own private cloud, depending on how you're billed for that, you might want to shut the virtual machine down after you get done with your testing or whatever you're trying to work on. And then we want you to be able to walk away with resources that you can learn. And then I would say the most important thing out of this workshop, right, is the content that's on the SQL Server 22 GitHub site. Know that that's there. Take this information, use the other product information from other videos and other presentations and other work groups, and just kind of keep it rolling in terms of your constant knowledge about not just SQL Server 22, but cloud data platforms, whether it's GCP or AWS or Azure, or what are the other non big three clouds that are out there. Again, real quick, I'm Tim McAlilly. I'm a senior cloud solution architect here in the DC area. I live in Centerville, Virginia. I have a specialization in SQL Server, literally, because I'm older. Since I don't have a lot of hands-on, I can't tell you war stories, but I was there when it was still around. SQL Server 6.0, SQL Server 6.5, 7.0, 2000, 2005, and on. So I got about 24 years in IT, almost all of it in SQL Server. But I also specialize in Azure Data Services, particularly Azure SQL Database, and then the flavors inside of those, including Azure SQL Managed Instance and SQL Server workloads on virtual machines, and then Power BI. I've been with this meetup since 2013 as an attendee, and then I think I told the story last time, so I won't tell it again, but I will. I think I took over, not took over, but started to help out in 2014, and then by the time like 4 or 5 years later, we'd moved the meetup to Reston, Virginia, for the days before COVID, and we started to do events and things like that. So I just bring that up because 2023 is I think that's my last year. I think I'm going to hand the torch over. We've got a good person that's interested. His name's AJ. He's great. So I'm going to hand it off to him. And of course, we've got Prashant Boyer, who's been helping out as well. He's a good person and a good friend and resource. But anyway, if you need to connect with me on LinkedIn, do that. And I'll connect with you on LinkedIn. Just mention that you're trying to learn about SQL Server 22 or attended a meetup. That's let me know how you met me. So here's how the meetups have gone. We've last month, if you recall, we started a little bit late because I had a doctor's appointment and all that. But it's generally the meetups are Fridays at 11:30 a.m. and they last generally an hour. Did I say generally 3 times? I might have said it. Anyway, 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. And then last Friday we talked, our last month we talked about the environment, the GitHub link, the slides. Don't sweat it. If you're new to the meetup, we'll do a little bit of a level set to show you the resources that we're talking about, and kind of get you back up to scratch. We'll spend a little time for each meetup. Today we're going to talk about an introduction to SQL Server 22, and then the topics for, the broader topics really are modules 2 through 6. So um, we will talk about the different flavors, not flavors, but the different features, hero features, one of the slide decks calls them, that connects out to Azure. We'll talk about uh, uh, how some of the query intelligence has improved in the internals of SQL Server. We'll talk about um, the security and scalability and availability that's been beefed up. And we'll spend 2 modules or 2 months on connecting to Azure, and we'll spend another couple of months on sort of the internals on security, scalability, and availability. And then we'll talk about, being able to leverage data virtualization and object storage, third party, connecting to third party storage, connecting to Amazon S3 storage. And we'll talk about, but it doesn't have to be Amazon S3. It could be other, third party storage. Then we'll talk about some of the new features in T-SQL for Module 6. And then November 17th will be sort of a review and what we learned, and wrap up and see if there's any questions. And uh, before then, we'll have met, I believe is going to be my replacement is, AJ, and he'll introduce himself. And so in one of these meetings, um, as we move through the rest of the year. But at least by November 17th, you'll have met AJ, and he'll have a list of 2024 dates. So the resources, slides, and instructions, right? If you look at this video, if you're looking at it on YouTube and you don't have time to kind of sit through the whole meeting and you just want to know where the materials are, they're right here. aka.ms/SQL 2022 workshop. There's where the slides are, all the labs, the instructions. Now the instructions are going to assume that you understand it, and I believe they're Windows focused. Well, let's take a look real quick, super quick. Let's take a look at what these instructions are. So this is let me sign in. No, I don't want to sign in as, there we go. So sorry, an account from my college for GitHub, and then I have an account from where. Anyway, so here's the SQL Server 22 workshop site. As I mentioned, we would kind of go over the materials every time, right? We'll kind of make sure that you know what's going on. So it talks about the workshop, talks about the learning objectives that we just looked at. It talks about the technologies that we're going to use, right? We're going to use obviously SQL Server 22. We're going to be digging into intelligent query processing and the enhancements to Microsoft Azure. We're going to be looking at the query store. We're going to be using Ledger for SQL Server. We are going to be hitting Polybase. We're going to be using Management Studio, of course, and Azure Data Studio. There's um, a scripts directory that you could you download from here, and then also some Windows and Linux setup instructions, the version of SQL that you need to install, um, just click and it starts to download, .back files that you can download from GitHub as well. An O-stress tool. It's an RML tool that does some assessment of your I/O capabilities on your SQL node on your disks, and then the workshop modules themselves. And then each workshop module, if you click on a module, like click on here, you can see the sort of the slideware. You can see, I believe, yeah, some videos and things like that. You get the exercises for that, and then for the exercises, if you dig into the workshop itself, and then dig into these top level containers. So for Azure Connected, You've got these labs here: Azure Active Directory, Azure Arc, MI Link, Purview, and Synapse Link, all ready to go. And you can go into Azure AD, and then you get into the exercise, and then it gives you some setup information. And then if you just want to play along at home, if you just want to watch for the year, or not participate, you're more than welcome to do that as well. I mean, no, there's no pressure. There's no grade that we're going to give you for attending or not attending, and we're not going to, bother you if you're, you know, there's no way to measure whether or not you're doing your labs. So you're good there. So this is the link for the SQL workshops, and then the channel to go and get the recordings is here. Sorry, I should have had this up. I apologize. I normally do. We've got an Azure Cloud Events channel, and there is a playlist, and there's the playlist for SQL Server 22 workshops. And there's our first. Oh, let me go back one. And there's our first work. Oops, sorry. God, I have a nasally voice. I hadn't realized that until just now. Boy, my voice is annoying. So I'll try to make it. I'll try. I'll try to make it a little bit more pleasant for you guys. Anyway, we do have a playlist on our Azure Cloud Event YouTube channel, and with the YouTube channel, we've got all kind of things. We've got data fests and previous years, meetups, things like that. So I would say there's about 72 videos on this site. We got some subscribers. Very good. But we're not going to mess around with all that today. We're not going to worry about that as much today. Let me pull this. Sorry, I like to look at the group and see who's raising their hands. I'm going to shut my camera off because I tend to talk with my hands, and I see my hands in the corner. All right, so yeah, so we put all our session recordings, we put those on YouTube, and then for the materials themselves, you'd hit the GitHub site. Even the slide deck, except for these intro slides. Also, if you want to, and I've bought this book on Kindle, there is a SQL Server 22 Revealed book by Bob Ward with a forward by Rowan Kumar, who's our SQL Server PD. I don't know. I don't pay attention to titles at Microsoft, but he's high up. He's higher up than Bob Ward. How about that? But I guess he runs SQL Server. It's recommended, not required, but it's good to when you're, let's say it's, the middle of April and you're just trying to do some testing, and we don't meet for 2 weeks and it's a Saturday and there's nobody to reach out to. It's good to have resources. And of course, you can go to Chat GPT or you can go to Google or wherever, Bing something, but also to have a book written by the author who also wrote, had a hand in authoring the slides that we're looking at. Again, we walk through the GitHub resources. Uh, um, we do have for the lab VM piece. I'm not walking through that so much, but if you go out into Azure, go out to Azure to the, let's get out here. Oh, I can go here. Yeah, 1 second. You go out to the Azure portal. I'll go out here and go to the Azure Marketplace. You can configure the exact same piece that I'm using today. Go Marketplace in Azure, and then type in SQL Server 2022, 23. You can see what the marketplace, and what a marketplace image is. It's a pre-configured virtual machine that's ready to go with SQL Server already on it. You can, bring, if you've got a license for it, you can bring your own license. You can dev test against it. And you can start with, you know, you can, test it for free, use the web edition, use the enterprise edition, use standard position. You can start with a pre set configuration. Um, you can have it configured to where it's more set for a dev test environment or more set for a production environment with either a general purpose or a memory optimized or compute optimized environment. And then you can go and build your virtual machine that's a Windows Server 22 instance with SQL Server 22 Enterprise Edition running on it. And you'll be off and running once you do that, because you don't have to worry about building putting an OS on a server and then putting SQL 22, finding going and downloading that and setting that's already installed on this. All you really have to do is go to the virtual machine and then download the databases, onto your server, and then restore them onto your SQL server. And then do make sure that if you're using a virtual machine and you're using it on Google Cloud, AWS, or Microsoft, or any of the other, private cloud, just shut it down when you're done using it. Do that. So the SQL Server workshop itself, we're going to talk about an introduction to SQL Server today, and then we're going to talk about connecting to SQL Server 22 with Azure for April and May. We're going to talk about accelerating performance with built-in intelligence for June, and then we're going to do 2 months of security, scalability, and availability. We'll do a month of access new sources with data virtualization, and then in October we'll do the enhance your application with new capabilities in it. And they update the main deck all the time. That's why I'm pointing you at the main deck. All these links down here for workshop and SQL Server 22 series and SQL Server 22 demos. We will probably use the demo slide for the Purview piece, because Purview requires some additional architectural footprints that aren't available in my non-production Azure tenant. So, and that's fine. I can still narrate you through it, but they have done these live demos, recorded them, and put them into PowerPoint slides. So if you go out to the GitHub link, you can get these links, you can get these slides. And again, if you're setting up your 22 environment, we recommend the image. I should move this slide further up, but again, configure your OS, choose the OS you're going to use, choose the the target that you're going to install SQL Server 22 on, deploy it, connect to it, and then configure your DBs on SQL Server 22, and you should be good to go. So it kind of seems like I'm wasting some time. I'll spend less time on that introductory material as we move forward. But let's talk about an overview of SQL Server 22 and then getting started with SQL Server 22. See if there's any questions. Oh, and side note, we don't have that big of a crowd. So if you have a question, just chime in and say, hey, this is me and I have a question. No worries. Because this little piece right here, I look for the hands being raised. But if I'm doing slides and with my slides in presenter mode, I might not see your hand raised. That's all I'm saying. So no harm, no foul if you just need to, hey, Tim, I have a question. So let's talk about an introduction to SQL Server 22. That is the downtown Dallas skyline. Why is it Dallas? Because Bob Ward, I told you he authored these slides. He's a Dallas resident and a Dallas fan. I commiserate with that. I'm a Dallas fan from when I learned about football back in 1977, when the Dallas Cowboys were in the wild card playoffs or the divisional playoffs against the Chicago Bears. And if you recall, there were two running backs in that game, Tony Dorsett and Walter Payton. So I was, and of course Roger Staubach. Just anyway, I'll drop my football. I had a rabbit hole right there. So SQL Server 22 is really, when you think about it, it's a logical progression, a logical compilation of some features that have been baked in since 2016. With 2016, we brought in the query store, which is where you get the ability to dig in at the database level and look at queries and plans and how they are impacting your CPU, your memory, how it's impacting other queries, what type of resources that your queries are taking up, And we'll look at Query Store here in just a minute. Oh, I don't have any workload for my query. That's okay. Um, Also, Polybase, being able to connect to Azure Blob Storage or HD Insight, Hadoop data on HD Insight, always encrypted. Our column level encryption that you can decrypt with a always encrypted driver on the application side, but always encrypted is where we did some not just prescriptive or not just our you should have separation of duties, but that's where we kind of begin to really do some technical enforcement of separation of duties. Because with always encrypted, if you don't have permission to take a look at that uh, encrypted column and you're an administrator, if you're SA on the server, you still cannot see it. If no matter what level of SQL instance permissions you have, unless you actually created the column, you're not going to be able to look at that encrypted data. You'll have to decrypt it with the right driver and permissions. We also had row level security, which is, um, and again, a lot of vendors have row level security, and Power BI has row level security, but our implementation of it is where it's very simple. It's similar to Power BI, where you have rows and then you have roles, and you put people in those roles, and those roles have permissions on whether or not they can see these rows in a table. A good scenario for that could be a management team, and you have a continental management team and an East Coast team and a West Coast team. Continental management team can see everything. The East Coast can see just the East Coast data, and the West Coast can see just the West Coast data. And you could enforce that with row level security and not have to build multiple tables or multiple views. We did some things internally to the engine, the query store. It just, SQL Server 2016 marked the arrival of that intelligent query processing set of features that we'll talk about, where it just begins to run faster. And then there's more features available on the standard edition for the just general surface area configurations, security offerings, and even some of the high availability pieces that were available in the standard edition. And then SQL Server 2017, that's where we really made our mark with support for Linux. So SQL Server on Linux and Ubuntu, SQL Server running on Linux containers, adaptive query processing, which is sort of a tie-in with your intelligent query processing, automatic tuning, both on the Azure SQL side. Azure SQL's automatic tuning is a little bit different, where it can, create an index, drop an index, or force a plan. Automatic tuning takes data, performance data about your SQL server, and and it'll have a feedback loop, if you will, to make sure that it tunes against that feedback loop. Support for the graph database, and then machine learning services came out in 2017. And then as we evolved into 2019, support for third-party storage and data virtualization, into a richer set of features under intelligent query processing. Accelerated database recovery, which helps both literally when you're doing transaction log and database restorations, also your transaction log activities for normal transaction logging, and for um, the speed and throughput of replication between nodes in an availability group. All that's all kind of baked into the accelerated database recovery. And then data classification, where you can uh, have data that you need to identify as needing a certain level of classification, like social security numbers or email addresses or home phone numbers, things like that. Or and you can do that manually or in an automated fashion, where it can find data in your database and say, hey, this looks like it needs to be classified. Here are some suggested labels for classifying. And then from there, you can do other things like audit against access on classified data and things like that. So that's SQL Server 2016 through SQL Server 2019. And you you guys remember SQL. Well, hope if you're 40, anyway, I won't put an age on it. But with SQL Server 2005, there was a kind of a difference there was kind of a difference in how the interface performed and what it looked like. It was a difference. It was a difference from SQL Server 2000 and SQL Server 7.0. So really 2016 is kind of a departure from that 2005 through 2012, and even 2014 is in there somewhere, but more on the 12 side. 2016 is a departure from you know the downstream versions of SQL Server. So 2016, 2017, and 2019, and then you have some additional needs, right? You have people that need data processing at different levels of their information architecture, and their information architectures are growing from. I have to sneeze. Excuse me. That'll be good for the recording. I'm sorry. I don't know if you heard that. I covered my mic. I hope I did. But you have a need for both on-prem and in the cloud technologies. I need my data processing on the edge of my network, maybe on an IoT device. Well, there's an answer for that. We might need just an on-prem or an installation of SQL Server, some flavor, on a virtual machine, either in a private cloud or a public cloud, or I need to deploy it on a Linux container or Kubernetes environment, or I need to have a SQL Server that's on-prem with the Arc extension on it that can kind of be integrate into Azure and be managed as a node in Azure, but it's on prem. It's got the Arc enabled SQL Server on it, and that's one of the connections we say. Or um, maybe an Azure Arc enabled managed instance. So I need to be able to manage my managed instances with the Arc enablement, or SQL Server virtual machine. So SQL Server, one thumbs up, right? That we love SQL Server, but it might be running on an Azure virtual machine, or you might be running an Azure SQL managed instance that's not part of the Arc enabled managed instance piece, or you might be running an Azure SQL database. So we've got, and you can connect to all of these, with Management Studio tools or Data Studio tools. Very familiar, very flexible in trying to meet the needs of going on-prem to cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid environments. Second. So what SQL Server 22 does is really tries to improve on one, this path that we mentioned from 2016 and 2017 and 2019 with, and then also meet the needs of these hybrid, um, you know, or cloud focused scenarios. So what we've done here is created some hero capabilities, some hero features, if you will. And the first hero capability is the link feature for managed instance. And that's where, without Windows clustering, you can create a partner node from your SQL Server 22 box and then have a read-only, if you wanted, or a secondary replica that's on a Azure SQL managed instance. You could do it with, just like a normal availability group on a SQL Server installation on a virtual machine workload, absolutely. But this is a way for you to maybe not have to build up a Windows failover cluster, not have to worry about a database availability group full architecture. You just want a secondary node that is replicating data that you could potentially fail over to if there was any problem. Failing over to a managed instance is a little bit easier. We'll talk about this next month. Failing over to the managed instance is a little bit easier than kind of failing back when the disaster period is over and you can return back to your original SQL Server 22 environment. But we'll talk about the link feature for managed instance. Very simple to do. Well, kind of, right? You got to have the network pieces in place to make sure the nodes can see one another and all that kind of good stuff. Also, if you need to incorporate the data that's in your SQL Server 22 databases, incorporate those into Azure Synapse, much like an Azure Synapse. It's not an Azure Synapse SQL pool per se, but it loads data quite easily into a staging area, landing zone from SQL Server 22 that gets accessed by Synapse, does your analytical processing, analytical crunching, and then that's presented ideally through our reporting tier, our Power BI reporting tier through Azure Synapse Link. And then we have Microsoft Purview integration. Now, what Purview is, it is our data classification, data dictionary, data glossary, um, you know, enterprise product, and it's really unique in that it can scale out, it can crawl or discover any type of data that you have permission to access. So anything in Azure, anything in third party clouds, anything on prem, it'll crawl it. It'll get contact information, um, schematic information about, well, what is it, structured, unstructured data, what's the file types, what are the columns and rows, um, what is or is it, what is the source and transformation of that data. It'll build a glossary of that data. It'll build a data dictionary for you. And then on top of Purview, you can also baked into Purview is Azure Synapse, and then also Microsoft Power BI, so you can leverage insights off of that data that you've connected to through the Purview data discovery methodologies. Very interesting. Now, the Purview integration to Azure SQL, excuse me, the Purview integration to Microsoft SQL Server 22 is that you could set up Purview data access policies inside of Purview and then have that policy applied downstream to a SQL Server 22 instance, and all of a sudden, people who have permissions to see but not write to the data can just see the data. For people that have permissions to read write on the data, they can now read write to the data with these Azure Purview policies. It's very, um, I believe Azure Purview is going to get bigger, personally. That's just my opinion. It'll become a sort of an enterprise hub for all things data. And this policy piece, being able to hit a SQL Server 22 instances, is a reflection of that. We also have Ledger for SQL Server. And what Ledger is, it's the ability to have records or tables that are immutable to tampering using blockchain technology. But the data about the changes, the change log, the change tracking is not stored inside of SQL Server. It's stored in encrypted storage elsewhere inside of your environment. We'll talk about Ledger, but what Ledger does is provide a basically uh, a preventative mechanism for making data changes that aren't authorized in a sales or salary or personal data table, either read access or write access. So what the ledger does is track access or activity changes outside of SQL Server, so that you can go and say, timestamp, person who did it, and the thing that they did, or the thing that was prevented. So you can have that tracked in Ledger. And then we have this built-in and query intelligence. So a couple of things, that's memory grant feedback, and that's where you are in a situation where maybe too much memory is being granted based on the type of SQL Server statement that's being run for. And again, there's been a lot done with the built-in query intelligence and adaptive query processing and intelligent query processing. So we've got changes since 2016, but there's even more changes in SQL Server 22 around, making sure the proper memory is granted, not too much memory for a query that doesn't need as much, but maybe previous versions of SQL Server would just blah, here's a bucket of memory. A parameter sniffing, a degree of parallelism, information, where you can leverage that built-in query intelligence and either tune your query or tune your server to handle the queries better with the information you get back. And again, most consistent data platform, edge to cloud, Azure Edge on the IoT devices, Azure Arc enabled data services, and then Azure SQL. Now for the SQL Server 22 capabilities, and again, those are icons and not words, but what you've got there is SQL Server 22 with some Azure cloud connections to a SQL Server managed instance to managed instance link, um, data source for Azure SQL or Azure Synapse, or of course Microsoft Purview that I just talked about, where you can have policies in Purview that work downstream and are enforced on the SQL Server 22 instances. Built-in query intelligence around feedback loops, things that prevent parameter sniffing. Um, there's a lot of them, and we will absolutely get into those. Security, scalability, and availability. Azure Active Directory authentication is really an Azure cloud connected capability, but it's also a security uh, capability in that you don't have to have an Azure Active Directory and a Windows Active Directory account. You can start to leverage security groups that you build in your Azure Active Directory and have those as part of the login topology, and maybe rely less on Windows Azure Active or Windows Active Directory. Data virtualization, object storage, so you can utilize third-party storage. You can utilize things like Amazon S3 storage buckets. You can leverage external tables and um, some of the Polybase like features. And then extending T-SQL, quite a few new T-SQL statements, new T-SQL capabilities, also new abilities to handle things like Java, JavaScript object notation or JSON. And then now deploying SQL Server 22. Um, Make sure that you've got the supported OSs. It's a Windows OS or a Red Hat or Ubuntu, or gosh, what is SLES? But anyway, make sure you've got the right um, uh, Linux version. Um, same upgrade options as in previous releases. The DB compat level for a SQL Server 22 database is 160. It does support older compatibility levels. You can do an upgrade, but that's a little bit risky, I think, because of everything that could go wrong. You might be upgrading a Windows Server 2016 box and a SQL Server 2016 node. There could be potential risk there. I'm a side by side guy. Or you can use for testing, you can use a marketplace image. For the SQL Server 22 setup, there are some things that you're not going to see, but you can still configure them later. Um, it's a separate download for some of them. So what's removed? And you can bring your own runtime packages for like R and Python and Java. You used to see this in the setup for SQL Server 2019, but not for 22. Polybase, um, Hadoop connectivity with Java. That's no longer a feature. Not a lot of people were doing it. That's why they took some of these things out. They were trying to do an evaluation, see if they had been removed. Um, oh, I see some questions here real quick. Let me just do something real quick. I see hey George. Jason, is Ledger a flavor replacement for change data tracking? No, it's not. Change data tracking is more of an internal application feature. Um, Ledger is literally a security type feature where you want to monitor changes on a table. I would say it's a deeper version of auditing, whereas change data tracking is like where you use the change in the transaction record to make other decisions about the change. And then thanks, George, for the SUSE Linux Enterprise, SLES. Thank you, George. All right. So yeah, they took out some of these things because they did not think that were being used very much, right? I mean, if you have a feature, why continue to support it if it's not being used? Polybase scale out groups. The machine learning server, no longer. Distributed replay, that's available as a separate download. And then deprecated features, which is a feature that is still in there, but it's not necessarily recommended or supported, and that's the stretch database. We demoed the stretch database in 2016, and that's where you can have an on-prem database or a database configured in SQL Server 2016 and up, and then have the partner database and table at an Azure SQL, and then archive that cold data out into your Azure SQL database, the stretch database. And then they've added Azure SQL extension for SQL Server, which again, you can manage your SQL Server 22 node uh, from the same portal in Azure as you can your other Azure data platform instances. Um, you can leverage things like Azure Active Directory and um, get alerts and things like that, and then pay as you go licensing for SQL Server 22. So instead of there is an option to um, pay as you use it, pay as you go for your SQL Server 22. I'm not so familiar with that. I should do some research on what that kind of digs into. With the Azure extension for SQL Server, um, what you do is you get this installed, and then it's required because you're able to use things like the Microsoft Defender, which is a real-time vulnerability threat analysis um, platform that's out in Azure. It's also out in Microsoft 365. It also integrates with Purview to get Purview policies, and also Azure Active Directory. So the Azure extension for SQL Server is important, but when you log in, you check the Azure extension for SQL Server piece. You need to also use some type of credentials to get you linked into Azure. So you'd use an Azure login or a principal, and then you pass it. If you're subscription ID and resource information. Give it some additional information about where you're going to be configuring this Azure this SQL Server node that's going to be using this Azure extension. Then you specify the edition. And again, we mentioned the edition, the web edition, the standard edition, the enterprise edition. And then with pay as you go, that's really an Azure feature. So you need to have an active Azure subscription, and you get billed through Azure. Um, and you need to have an Azure resource group, and have selected an Azure region and an Azure tenant and all that kind of good stuff to get that really to work. But it's less cost. It's kind of like leasing a car, right? Instead of paying how much to pay for my Camry, 22,000. Instead of paying $25,000, you can pay maybe 1,000 and kind of figure out what your next steps are. Or you can specify a free edition. A little bit deeper here, not deeper, but just a little bit more about this Arc enabled SQL Server piece, right? If you're going to leverage Azure Active Directory authentication, if you're going to leverage Microsoft Purview, if you're going to leverage Microsoft Defender, like pull in even your on-prem nodes into um, the Defender platform in Azure, which is a good thing, um, you'll need to do the Azure Arc enabled extension. It basically mimics the IaaS extension for if you were running a SQL Server workload on a virtual machine in Azure, you would install the IaaS extension. If you're going to install the Azure Arc extension, you could install it on a SQL Server that's not running in the cloud, that you want to make sure it has basically the same types of features. And then you can configure it before or after. A little bit deeper here, not kind of a different poke at the slide on Azure Arc extension for Azure extension for SQL Server. All these extensions kind of confuse me. Not confuse me, but like I pronounce them, I say them incorrectly. Again, the additions of SQL Server. I said web earlier. I'm a stupid idiot. It's for Express, Standard, and Enterprise, and of course the Developer Edition has all the features of the Enterprise Edition, but it's specifically for a dev test in non-production environments. So you can test out all the cool things that we'll talk about over the year and install a free version of SQL Server 22. Just make sure you don't put it in prod, because then you'll be charged some money. Um, but again, with the enterprise, unlimited cores, unlimited memory, Azure Synapse link feature for SQL managed instance, built-in query intelligence with the degree of parallelism feedback, cost estimation feedback, memory grant feedback, contained availability groups. You can also set SQL Server 22 on Linux containers and Kubernetes. It supports Linux, Red Hat 8.0 through 8.5, Ubuntu. I won't read all that. but it supports those versions of Linux. It supports, there's a new DTC, distributed transaction coordinator management support. Not supported um, if on SQL Server 22 on non-Windows systems, TLS and Intel, the backup compression. But you can read about the Linux pieces. Again, this slide is out there on GitHub. So if you do install on Linux, which I encourage you to try, I should try it. Take a look at these links here. And again, the Azure on a virtual machine. Um, in the marketplace, there's a marketplace image for Linux already configured. It uses the IaaS extension agent, right? Because it's an Azure virtual machine and it's SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine, so it's going to use the IaaS extension. Again, with that, you get it's a snapshot backup supported with Azure Disk Snapshots, and there's several different virtual machine sizes, and the portal experience is always being updated. So, and also you should be able to do Azure authentication unless you're in like a for example, I'm in a non-prod tenant, so we don't have the ability to do Azure authentication. Same with Purview. So if you're going to do an upgrade from SQL Server 22 from 2016 or even 2012, if you need to be 2012 SP4 or later, or if you're 2014, you can be 2014 SP3 or later, 2016 SP3 or later, or 2017 or 2019 will support an upgrade from that version to SQL Server 22. And then with and we'll get into this more with um, the Azure SQL managed instance link piece. This is really kind of the tie. So when you migrate from SQL Server to an Azure managed instance, you want to be sure that the apps run in the cloud without needing to make any changes and having that higher degree of SQL Server engine compatibility means less, refactoring and one less thing to worry about. And then that degree of compatibility is controlled by the database compatibilities at the database level in the SQL Server database properties. And the managed instance database compatibility level is set to the highest compatibility level by default, which is on par with the latest version of the SQL Server engine. So managed instance was built on the SQL Server 2016 engine, making it compatible with the SQL Server engines from 2016 on. And then the commitment not to retire older SQL engine code makes SQL managed instance backward compatible with SQL Server engines going all the way back to 2008. And then before migrating to SQL managed instances, you could use tools like Azure Migrate or Azure Data Studio to do an assessment of your data state to confirm that your databases are ready for the cloud. And that includes both the version levels, the compatibility levels, but also certain objects inside of your databases. And then we see here, um, this won't work. Like if you do a copy only backup on a managed instance, when you do a restore of that managed instance onto SQL Server 2019 or sorry, on levels down, further down, 2017, 2016, it's not going to restore, right? Because the backup was run on a version higher. Get a compatibility issue, but not with, and we'll take a look at, we'll see this in the managed instance link. You can, with managed instance, do a copy only backup on your managed instance and restore that copy only backup onto SQL Server 22. Now I have a customer, very big company, that said that they have restored the copy only backup from managed instance onto SQL Server 2019. It I haven't seen it. I should test it. I would say it's potentially not supported, but it has worked for them. And they've also used other downstream migration because they had these customer projects, and when they were handing the data platform off to a customer project, the customer said they weren't ready to use a managed instance, so they had to move everything from managed instance to virtual machines. It's a whole thing, but they also did want to use SQL Server 22. And then the server compatibility levels and what it supports. So SQL Server 22 supports all the way down to SQL Server 2008. And you can see the different compatibility levels that are supported per version. So SQL Server being cloud connected again. This is what we'll talk about in the coming months. We'll talk about um, Azure SQL Managed Instance Connection. We'll talk about the Azure Synapse link to Azure SQL pools. We'll talk about Microsoft Purview with schema and policy enforcement. We'll talk about Azure Active Directory authentication and things you can leverage if you've got the ARC enabled extension where you can leverage Microsoft Defender and, of course, Azure Active Directory and, of course, Purview and make your other connections. We'll also talk about the ability to leverage things like distributed availability groups, and we'll dig in a little bit more into the agents and some of the things like self hosted integration runtimes. All right, real quick knowledge check. Which one of these? Which is one of the major categories for SQL? Which of these is one of the major categories for SQL Server 22 features? Right, it's A and D. It's cloud connected and um, built in query intelligence. You could say Azure Arc is a feature and contained availability groups, but it's not a major feature. It's kind of a trick question, I think. The Azure extension for SQL Server provides which of these capabilities? Right? Azure Active Directory. Synapse Link doesn't really require it. Managed disaster recovery, of course not. Data virtualization doesn't require that. And then it's not required for setting up an Azure virtual machine. All right, so what we've talked about this morning is just an overview. We've talked about SQL Server 22, its Azure enablement. We briefly kind of talked about intelligent query processing and built-in query intelligence. We've talked about just high level security, scalability, and availability, and then the high level data virtualization, object storage, and then some of the T-SQL features. But we're going to spend, you know, at least one and sometimes two meetups to talk about this agenda right here. All right, guys, do we have any questions before we break for the day? I grab my meetup here. Oh wow. Sorry. All right. Well, hearing no questions, I will go ahead and stop the recording. My Teams is doing something weird. I hope everybody can hear me. Okay, thank you. Okay, very good. All right, guys, I'm going to stop the recording. Have a good weekend. I'm going to see done